So, would a universal background check law really be backdoor registration? Well, yes, it would be. Universal background checks are essentially national registration. And here's the proof. Does this scene from the movie Red Dawn, the original one back from the 80s, does this ring a bell?
Вы хотите меня видеть? Да, да. Идите в спортивные, рабочие викиды и принесите мне государственный номер 4473. Желто я в той картотеке, вы имеете полное описание.
Now, I know most of us are familiar with this form who are into guns and know kind of the details of the gun laws. However, I'm making this video as a quick reference video to show friends, family, people in the middle who may own a gun but may not really be into guns and may not know the details of the gun laws. This is the Form 4473. It is a federal form created by the ATF to be put out and has to be filled out for every gun purchase when you buy a gun from a federal firearms licensed dealer. So that means whenever you buy a gun from a store or a licensed dealer at a gun show, i.e. pretty much anybody who has a booth at a gun show, this form has to be filled out. So what all is on this form? Well, most of us, especially the first time we bought a gun, all we really remember is filling out the first page where we put our last name, first name, middle name, street address, city, county that we live in, state zip code, city and state that we were born in, height, weight, sex, birth date, and we can optionally put our social security number, which they claim will help prevent you being misidentified as somebody else with a similar name. And then we remember answering the questions as you go down on the page and pretty much asking if you're a felon, if you've ever been indicted for a felony, if you've ever been adjudicated as being mentally defective in a court of law, if you've been dishonorably discharged from the armed forces, if you've ever renounced your U.S. citizenship, if you've ever been convicted of domestic violence, and so on. And then after you answer those questions, we remember having to sign here certifying that our answers are true and correct and that we haven't given any false information, and that if we have, we risk being prosecuted under the penalty of law. And also signing saying that we are the actual transferee or person buying the firearm. And while we may vaguely remember there being a check block to say whether or not we're buying a handgun or a long gun underneath, or both, that's pretty much where it stops for us. That's all we ever fill out. Most of us never look at the rest of the form because the rest of the form is supposed to be filled out by the firearms dealer or the transfer or seller of the firearm. So if you scroll down to the third page here, what do you see? You see blocks for the firearms dealer to fill out, listing what firearms are being sold by the manufacturer, model, serial number, the type of weapon that it is, and the caliber. And it doesn't matter if you're buying one gun or 4 guns. The dealer has to list every single firearm being sold. So there they have a list of every gun you're buying by make, model, and serial number. Now tell me how that is not registration if it's required for every single gun sale under any kind of universal background check law. And right now, you can say that's not a registration because right now we don't have universal background checks. And right now, if you buy a gun from a store, if you bought a gun from a store 2 years ago, who's to say you hadn't sold it? You could have sold it. You could have sold one of those guns or all 3 of them. So this should be pretty evident now, self-evident, that if you require this form to be filled out for a background check every time someone sells a gun or buys a gun, that means no gun can be sold by a law-abiding citizen without a government record of every single firearm sold by make, model, and serial number and to who bought it and where they live. And this would apply to everybody. It doesn't matter if you're selling your gun to a neighbor you've known for years or a coworker. I mean, even someone like me, I work in law enforcement. If this law is passed, I would have to fill out one of these forms to sell one of my personal guns to another officer. You would have to fill out one of these forms to sell it to a coworker at the office. Potentially even to your dad or your brother. And even if there are exceptions for family, that's still essentially a national registration because to be exempt from it, you had to sell it for a family member, and there's no way you're not going to remember who has it if the government ever decides to start confiscating guns, which, as we all know, historically in countries that have had registration, confiscation does eventually follow. So yes, I think it's quite evident that this is a backdoor registration scheme. There would be a government record of every gun bought and sold by a law-abiding citizen. Now, there wouldn't be any records for the criminals because they don't care about the law. They're going to sell the guns anyway. But see, the government doesn't care about the criminals having the guns. They may claim to, but they don't. They actually kind of need them. You see, the threat of criminals puts fear into the sheep, which causes the sheep to ask for more power to the government to keep them safe. They know the criminals are too unorganized and too short-sighted and selfish to pose a real threat to them, and also really small in numbers. But the citizens, they can actually pose a threat to the power of the ruling class if the ruling class decides to become fully tyrannical or if the people get tired of their shit. So they don't care where the criminals' guns go. They're worried about where your guns go and where they're at. First, as I said, it becomes a national backdoor registration. But furthermore, why should I be burdened? Why should my rights be further burdened than they already are to sell a gun to a friend or a family member or a neighbor that I've known for a long time? Or even to a stranger? Why should I have to go to a gun dealer and pay them whatever money, could range anywhere from $20 to $50 for a transfer fee, to sell my own property? I've declined gun sales before because the person simply seems sketchy. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, passing a universal background check law will not stop anything. It'll only be used as control and registration. That's it. And the politicians will tell you that, well, these forms stay with the dealer. They don't go to the government. That's not very comforting when you consider a few things. First being that when a dealer goes out of business, guess where these forms go? The ATF. The government. Guess who can inspect these forms anytime they want? The government. The ATF. And guess who has been caught making copies of these forms illegally? They're not supposed to be allowed to do that. Guess who's been caught making copies of these forms? To take back to their government office. The ATF. So I think it should be quite clear that universal background check legislation is ultimately registration. And now I know some people may not like the NRA. I don't trust the NRA. I'm not a member. I'm a member of Gun Owners of America. However, Colion Noir, I think he's a good dude. Philosophically, everything I've seen him say or heard him say has been sound. I think he's just used the NRA to advocate. He's not anyone high up there. And I think even if you don't trust him or like the NRA, you don't dump the baby out with the bathwater. And I think this is a great video that points out the negative consequences of passing a universal background check law. So I would recommend showing this video that I just made to everyone you know, just so they can look at the form and see how it would be a national registration. And maybe this one by Colion Noir too. He's a little bit more articulate than I am, but he doesn't actually show you the form in this video. Anyway, thanks for listening, and do everything you can to make sure that we can stop any kind of universal background check legislation or red flag gun confiscation legislation from passing. Now is a more dangerous time than ever, now that the sheep have gone back to sleep under the fraud known as Trump.